How exactly do our muscles generate force throughout the movement? Well, there are three ways. One is the concentric phase of that lift, the second is the eccentric phase of that lift, and the third, that we all know on our channel, is the isometric phase of that lift. Let's go into detail on all three so that we're knowledgeable on the subject, and then you can choose which works best for you depending on what you're training for. Let's get into it. When we break down the three fundamental phases of lifting, we're delving into the mechanics of how muscles generate and manage force during movement. Each phase plays a distinct role in both muscle development and overall performance, and understanding the science behind them is essential for optimizing training and improving strength, hypertrophy, and endurance. First is our concentric phase, force production and muscle shortening. The concentric phase occurs when a muscle contracts and shortens while overcoming resistance. This is the phase most commonly associated with the lifting part of an exercise, like when you're pressing the weight up during a bench press or curling a dumbbell toward your shoulder in a bicep curl. During the concentric phase, actin and myosin filaments within the sarcomeres, the smallest functional unit of a muscle fiber, interact in a process called the sliding filament theory. Myosin heads from cross bridges with actin and, using ATP as energy, pull the actin filaments toward the center of the sarcomere. This shortening of the muscle fiber generates tension, which is transferred through the tendons to create movement at the joint. From a neuromuscular standpoint, motor units, a motor neuron, and the muscle fibers it innervates are recruited to generate the necessary force to move the load. The intensity of the contraction depends on how many motor units are activated and their firing frequency. During maximal concentric contractions, the nervous system recruits larger motor units, particularly those containing type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers, which are capable of producing high force output but fatigue quickly. Since power is a function of force and velocity, training the concentric phase with explosive movements, think of Olympic lifts and plyometrics, improves the body's ability to generate force quickly. The concentric phase is metabolically demanding, meaning it requires more ATP and burns more calories per unit of time compared to the eccentric and isometric phases. For example, in a squat, the concentric phase is the upward movement where your quadriceps, hamstrings, and glutes shorten to extend the hips and knees, propelling you back to a standing position. Next, we have our eccentric phase, force absorption and muscle lengthening. The eccentric phase, often referred to as the negative portion of a lift, involves a muscle generating force while lengthening. This phase occurs when the resistance is greater than the force produced by the muscle, such as when you're lowering a weight back down during a bicep curl or squatting down during a squat. During the eccentric phase, the cross bridges between actin and myosin filaments are still active, but instead of pulling actin toward the center of the sarcomere, they resist the external force that is pulling the actin filaments apart. This controlled elongation of muscle fibers generates tension and allows for deceleration of the movement. Eccentric contractions are unique because they can generate greater force with less energy expenditure compared to concentric contractions. This is due to the mechanical properties of muscle fibers and connective tissues. Eccentric contractions also involve the storage of elastic energy within the tendons and muscles, which can be released during the following concentric phase. Think of how your muscles feel loaded before you jump. There are three main benefits for the eccentric phase. The first, hypertrophy. The eccentric phase is particularly effective for inducing muscle damage, which is one of the key mechanisms for muscle growth, which is hypertrophy. The controlled elongation under load creates micro tears in the muscle fibers, prompting the body to repair and build them stronger and larger. 2 is tendon strength. Eccentric loading has been shown to strengthen tendons, increasing their tensile strength and elasticity. This adaptation is beneficial for injury prevention and improving force transmission from muscle to bone. 3 is greater force production. Eccentric contractions allow muscles to handle more weight than they can during the concentric phase, which is why eccentric focused training, aka negatives, is often used to push strength development beyond plateaus. For example, in the eccentric phase of a bench press, as you lower the barbell to your chest, the pectorals, triceps, and deltoids lengthen while still generating force to control the descent. Lastly, we have our isometric phase, stabilization and tension without movement. The isometric phase occurs when a muscle generates force without changing length. There is no visible movement at the joint, yet the muscle fibers are still contracting. Isometric contractions can occur at any point in a lift, but they are often used in exercises where the goal is to hold a position against resistance, like holding a plank or pausing during a squat. During an isometric contraction, the actin and myosin filaments engage, but instead of sliding past each other, as they do in concentric or eccentric contractions, they lock in place. This creates a high level of tension without changing the length of the muscle fibers. Isometric contractions also have a unique effect on the neuromuscular system. They help improve the recruitment of motor units and can train muscles to exert force at specific joint angles, which is particularly useful for enhancing stability and strength in functional movements or sport-specific positions. There are many benefits to the isometric phase of a lift, but we're going to keep it to just 3. The first is joint stability. Isometric exercises are excellent for improving joint stability by strengthening the muscles around the joint without stressing the joint through repetitive motion. This makes isometrics ideal for rehabilitation and injury prevention and staving off mechanical abrasion. Number 2 is time under tension. Isometric holds increase the time that muscles are under tension, which is a key factor for muscle endurance and hypertrophy. The longer a muscle is under tension, the more stimulus it receives for growth. The last is number 3, strength transfer. Although isometric contractions primarily build strength, they can improve overall strength when combined with concentric and eccentric training. This makes them a valuable tool for improving strength in sticking points or weak ranges of motion. For example, in a plank, the core muscles, rectus abdominis, obliques, and transverse abdominis, generate tension without moving to stabilize the spine, creating an isometric contraction. Understanding the interplay between these 3 phases is critical for developing an effective training program. If you want a concentric focus, use fast, explosive movements with moderate to heavy loads. Incorporating exercises like cleans, snatches, or plyometrics is ideal for improving power and force production. If we want a more eccentric focus, slowing down the eccentric portion of a movement, think of 3 to 5 second descents, increases time under tension and forces the muscles to work harder to control the load. This approach is excellent for hypertrophy and tendon strength. Now, if you want a more isometric focus, adding pauses at specific points during a lift, think of pause squats or bench press holds, increases time under tension and builds strength at critical sticking points. Isometric only exercises like planks or wall sits can also target specific muscles for stability and endurance. Now, we talked a little bit about hypertrophy. When we typically talk about muscle hypertrophy, which is essentially increasing a muscle size, we usually think about weightlifting, but did you know that you could also increase muscle size with isometrics? If you're interested in learning about that, here's a link right here. Check our video out on it, and we'll see you there.